Have you ever been scrolling on Instagram or Ravelry or Etsy and found a pattern you really wanted to make? And when you click on the Ravelry link and you go to the pattern, there's all this information you have no idea what to do with. This video is for you! If you don't know me, my name is Marielle from HandmadebyMariquita. Welcome back. This is just a wonderful channel where we talk a lot about knitting and crafting and creativity and culture and all of the things. So if that's something that you enjoy, consider subscribing and liking this video. If you like this video and find it helpful, the first thing I would love to talk about is how the heck do you even find a knitting pattern? You might be scrolling on Instagram and find an image of a hand knit pattern that you really love and think is really beautiful. You want to knit it, but you have no idea where to find it. Let me point you and introduce you to Ravelry. Ravelry is a knitter and crochet girlie's best friend. They have such a large catalog of free knitting and crochet resources, and you're able to find lots of different designers, whether they're huge designers like Petite Knit, Sari Nordland, etc., or if they're more indie designers that are a little bit less well known, maybe just now starting their business or growing their business now, or building their catalog. So for the purposes of this video, I am demonstrating all of the processes that I would go through if I wanted to knit a knitting pattern. Now, disclaimer, everyone goes through different processes or has different ways of thinking when they see the information on the Ravelry page, but I'm going to try to make this as simple and step-by-step as possible so you can really follow along and apply it to whatever pattern you want to make when you find a pattern that you want to make. So for the purposes of this video, I have chosen personally a pattern by a bit of a smaller knitwear designer because I wanted to elevate their business and their incredible handmade designs as well. And this is also a pattern that is on my favorites list in my sweaters favorite category on Ravelry, and I've been wanting to make it for quite a while. And so I just wanted to walk you through the process of what I would do if I were making this sweater, which I hope to one day do. So the first thing that I wanted to take you through is go on Ravelry.com. And on Ravelry.com, I have selected the Golden Hours sweater by Joanna Phillip. This is a beautiful drop shoulder sweater construction, which is for the most part top down. In this particular case, this is top down, which means you start at the top of the sweater and you work down. It is also seamless, which means you don't have to do any sewing to sew pieces together, and that also means that for the most part, the sweater is knit in the round. So the first information that I see when I pull up this project page is the Golden Hours sweater by Joanna Phillip. I see some beautiful, lovely pictures. And then at the top of the page, I see where it was first published, what craft it is, the category, so if it's a sweater or if it's a sock or if it's a hat, something like that, when it was published, the suggested yarn, the yarn weight, the gauge, needle size, yardage, sizes available, and the languages it's published in. That is a whole lot of information and could be quite overwhelming for someone who is new to following patterns and knitting, or new to Ravelry, or is just trying to find a pattern and figure out if they have the yarn in stash to make it. So I'm going to walk you step by step through my process of figuring out those measurements for your size, what size you need to make, how much yardage or meterage you need to make that size, what materials you need, as well as some different yarn suggestions, both in weight and composition of yarn. The first thing I wanted to talk about is how to choose your size. Knitting sweater patterns in general are measured by a standardized size chart. In the process of grading, the designer finds information on standardized women's bust circumference, upper arm circumference, armhole depth, lots of things like that, which are basically just a lot of different measurements so that they get the right fit, right? So to find your size, you need to take your bust circumference measurement. Once you know your bust circumference measurement, either centimeters or inches, patterns will show sizing measurements in one of two ways. They will either show the actual bust size that the garment is designated to fit, So if you have a bust size of 96 centimeters, it will show you the actual bust size that bust measurement fits. This particular pattern is a little bit different in that it shows the finished garment chest circumference. So your actual chest circumference is your actual body measurement. The garment circumference for the chest or the bust is the circumference of the bust on the actual garment. So in this particular pattern, we need to figure out which size we should make based on our actual bust circumference, add the intended range of positive and negative ease, which we'll talk about in just a second, and then we get the finished chest circumference. So this sweater is designed to have approximately 20 to 31.5 centimeters of positive ease at the chest. So if you're in between sizes, you can really choose, like, for example, I'm usually between size 2 and size 3. You might be between size 7 and size 8. You can choose based on how much positive or negative ease you want, based on whatever the pattern explains. If you're wondering what the heck is ease, what is negative ease, what is zero ease, what is positive ease, basically ease is how many centimeters and inches less than or greater than your actual body measurements the garment is. For example, if you have a chest measurement of 96 and you are working on a garment that has 4 centimeters of positive ease, then your actual garment circumference would ideally be around 100 centimeters. So there is a little bit of math when the pattern explains these kinds of measurements with the finished garment measurement rather than the intended size it's meant to fix. But a lot of pattern designers do this strategically because they want you as the knitter to decide how much ease you want your garment to have. So my bust size is about 96.5, 97 centimeters. So we can look at the finished chest circumference. The approximate positive ease is between 20 and 31.5 centimeters. So we need to add 96, 96.5 plus 20. That would be 116.5 centimeters roughly. Now, the finished chest circumference that are listed on the pattern, for size 1, we have 106.5, size 2, we have 115, size 3, we have 122. Now, if I'm looking for an intended ease-ish of 116, 115 is a little bit less than 20, and 20 is the lower range that is intended for the garment. So I might size up to a size 3 because it gives a range of 122 centimeters for the finished chest circumference. So if I choose size 3 at 122 centimeters in a finished chest circumference, that gives me around 25.5 centimeters of positive ease. So that is right in the range because, again, the range is 20 to 31.5 depending on your bust measurement. If your bust measurement is 130 centimeters, we can start with the lowest amount of ease, which is 20 centimeters, and add that to 130, which would give us 150. Size 8 is 152.5 centimeters, and size 9 is 160 centimeters. This would fall right between sizes, again, because 152.5 is 2.5 centimeters more positive ease than the lowest range. But 160 centimeters also falls within that range, just on the upper end. So in this case, it's really up to you if you want more of an oversized fit or if you want less of an oversized fit. In choosing your size, you need to keep in mind what the stitch texture of the garment is. In this case, it uses cables in kind of a rib-like fashion. Cables tend to pull in, but rib is quite stretchy. So those are two different factors that you need to kind of keep in mind. Now, this gets a little complicated when we start looking at yarn substitutions. So the next category is yarn substitutions. Usually patterns will have at least 1 or 2 different suggested yarns. This pattern only has one suggested yarn, which is the Biche Bouche Le Lamb's Wool. Hopefully I said that correctly. So when looking at yarn substitutions, if it's not already written on the project page to figure out if you already have the yarn that you need or not, or if you want to buy new yarn, what yarn you need to buy if you don't want to buy the suggested pattern yarn, I look at two different factors. One, I look at the weight of the yarn. This is really important because knitting patterns follow a gauge. So your gauge is how many stitches in a 10 centimeters by 10 centimeter square or 4-inch by 4-inch square. How many stitches does it take to get to 10 centimeters? And how many rounds, in this case, because we're working in the round, you need to reach 10 centimeters. But in this pattern, the gauge is 21 stitches and 29 rows. So we are looking for a yarn with a similar weight, similar composition that will behave similarly and give us the same gauge. This is also why gauge swatches are particularly important for garments, especially if you're a little unsure or in between sizes on how much positive or negative ease you want from your pattern. What I often do when I'm trying to choose a yarn that's not the suggested yarn, because a lot of patterns use suggested yarn that is quite expensive for everyday like hobby knitters, for good reason, because they're making a sample for their business and it's their own design and it's the sample reference picture to show everyone what the pattern can do and what the stitch definition looks like. So it makes quite a lot of sense. However, for the everyday person, is it always super affordable? So I always like to look for cheaper options that still have good quality and similar yarn composition and will give me a similar gauge. So one of the websites that I really enjoy using is called yarnsub.com. You can basically type in any yarn and it will give you very, very similar matches for that yarn. So in this case, I typed in the suggested yarn, which is biche et bouche, and basically it gave me a whole long list of substituted yarns that I can choose based on really what I'm wanting, and it gives pros and cons for each yarn. So first we want to look at the yarn composition, right? So this yarn is made with 100% wool, and it gives a suggested gauge of 19 to 24 stitches per 10 centimeters. So when we're choosing a yarn, we might want to consider choosing another similar yarn that is 100% wool as well, or has another similar composition, like where it's mostly wool and maybe a small percentage of something else. I tend to choose yarns that are substituted with at least some alpaca in them, just because I have quite sensitive skin on my arms and my chest. I like to sub in at least a percentage of alpaca to help make the yarn a little bit bearable and less scratchy. So what I really like to look at in choosing yarns that are a little more cost effective, I sometimes just exclusively shop drops if I'm really looking for a really cost effective yarn that is fairly high quality for what you get for the price. I use drops exclusively for the first 4 years of my knitting career, where I was actually knitting garments. So starting in 2020, 2019, it was just so cost effective. And at the time I was an undergraduate in college, and so I didn't have money like that. So I just really wanted a cost effective yarn. So I really recommend drop for that reason, if you're just starting out or something like that. Now we need to look through their catalog to find a yarn that has one similar composition, yes, with wool, but also has similar gauge and weight. We are looking for a similar DK weight that's gauge is around 21 stitches and 29 rows, just like the pattern suggests. So I already have sort of a DK in mind. Drops Lima is a really great compromise for this. The suggested needle size is 4 millimeters and the suggested gauge is 21 stitches by 28 rows. So that's pretty spot on. 21 stitches by 29 rows is what the pattern recommends. So that's almost an exact match. Now, Drops Lima is not 100% wool. It is 65% wool and 35% alpaca. So you can kind of just play around with your yarn composition, figure out what you like, what you don't like. But for the purposes of this, let's just say Drops Lima is the yarn we want to go for. The next thing we need to look at is how much yarn do we get? So we've already chosen a size, we've already chosen a yarn. Now we need to do some math to calculate how much yardage or meterage we need to get the amount of yarn we need for the size we're making. All right, I wanted to walk you guys through how I personally calculate the yardage or meterage you'll need for each size for each sweater. So in this example, there are 3 methods that I'm gonna walk you through, and then there are 2 sizes that I'm gonna do to show just different math, just to show how it works across sizes. So the first method that this pattern actually uses is the number of skeins needed for each size. So for size 1, it uses 9 skeins. For size 9, it uses 15 skeins of le lamb's wool. You might be wondering, well, since I'm using a different yarn, since I'm using Drops Lima, how does this connect? How can I figure this out? Blah, blah, blah. Most pattern designers will include, even if they just include the amount of skeins they use, they will also include the information for how many grams are in one skein, as well as what the grams equate to. The lamb's wool uses 50 grams for every 170 meters, which I have here. Or if you think in yards, here's the number here. Basically, we can do some maths. So if they use, for size 3, 10 skeins, we basically need to multiply 10 by how many meters are in each skein. In this case, 170. Now that we know how many meters go into size 3, how do we figure out what we need for Drops Lima? How do we know how many skeins of Drops Lima to buy? So in Drops Lima, 50 grams equates to 100 meters, which is perfect for us. So basically, we need to divide this number, 1,700, divided by 100. So now we have 17 skeins that we need to get of Drops Lima. So this is using method 1. If they give you the number of skeins, but they don't give you any other information, this is how you can figure out how many skeins you need to buy. So let me just mark method 1. Now I'm going to demonstrate method 2 for size 8. So this pattern does kind of tell us how many grams are needed for each size, but in a roundabout way, because they tell us how many skeins there are for each size. Each skein is a 50 gram skein, right? So if we use how many skeins for size 8, if we use 14 skeins for size 8, we can multiply 14 by 50, and this is what pattern designers like Petite Knit will have. So instead of telling you how many skeins they start with, they tell you how many grams are needed to make that particular size. So we kind of got to that step on our own. You obviously don't need to calculate how many grams are needed because we already have the skeins information. So that would just be doing more work, you know? But if you ever find a pattern designer that does give information for how many yards or meters you need to make a particular size and it's in grams, now you know how to do it. So basically you need to figure out, is this a 100 gram skein or is this a 50 gram skein? In this case, le lamb's wool is 50 gram skeins. So we would take the total amount of grams and divide it by 50, and then we get 14. So that's how we know how many skeins, and then we could go back and do the same step as step 1. So I'm just going to continue on. Now we have 14 skeins of the lamb's wool that we need for size 8, right? So now we need to figure out how many exact meters is that. We do that in the same way as step 1 over here. So 14 times 170, because again, over here, 170 meters per 50 grams equals 1,380. So this is how many meters we need to knit size 8, right? So now, how can we translate that to Drops Lima if we want to still use Drops Lima, right? So here we have the information for Drops Lima. 50 grams game is 100 meters. We already have the amount of meters we need. Now we just need to figure out how many skeins. So we divide that by 100. So this is where it gets tricky, and those 2 categories of what kind of knitter you are really come into play. So we have the yarn chicken gang, and they would say, oh, 23.8, let me just buy 23. or on bigger needles to make the gauge bigger so it doesn't take as much yarn, blah, blah, blah. That makes me nervous because sure, if this decimal was less than 5, maybe. But to me, I would just go ahead and buy 24 skeins because obviously you can't buy 0.8 of a skein, right? So for me, buying from Drops, I'm in the US, I'm US based, so I would have to pay a VAT, I would have to pay shipping costs, I would have to pay taxes, obviously, and all those different things would just be more than it's worth, you know what I'm saying? So yeah, in this case, I would just buy 24 skeins of Drops Lima to make size 8. So now we have method 2 we've talked about. All right, method 3, easiest method. We basically skip this step and we skip this step to figure out how many meters we need, right? Because our pattern actually gives that, and some patterns don't, but this pattern does, which is very nice. It says this amount of skeins or this amount of meters / yards, right? So for size 3, going back over here, size 3 says 1650 yards, which is pretty close to what we calculated up here. So with these two calculations, you might be slightly off by like 100-ish yards or meters or whatever metric you're using, right? So this says more specifically 1650 meters will be used, right? So we got that information directly from the pattern page on Ravelry. Now to figure out how many skeins of Drops Lima we need to buy, we already figured out up here at 17, but let's see if we're correct or if this is like overshooting it, right? So Drops Lima is 100 meters per 50 gram skein. So now we can divide this number by 100, we get 16.5. So we're pretty close, right? Again, the same situation. Do you want to play yarn chicken? Do you want to call it safe, right? I would be in camp, call it safe, right? But lots of people are in camp, play yarn chicken. That personally makes me stressed. Anyways, so yeah, this is kind of walking you through. We've done all 3 steps, and I hope you can read my handwriting. One thing I did not mention before when I was talking about yarn substitutions, what colorway you might want to choose, what kind of yarn you might want to choose, and things like that, I want to talk about the difference between solid colors, heathered colors, variegated colors, self-striping colors. These are all different kinds of yarn that the yarn might come in a different colorway. For this pattern, this is a heavily textured pattern. It has lots of cables. So a variegated yarn, a self-striping yarn, and a super dark yarn might not be great options because the dark yarn would completely hide all the beautiful stitch definition that makes the pattern what it is. The variegated yarn might also do the same thing. Self-striping yarn with vertical ribbed columns, kind of like this pattern has, might not be the best choice because usually self-striping is horizontal stripes. So those are just my thoughts, but also do whatever you want to do. Also, another tip is to think about the yarn composition and whatever kind of stitch texture you have. So if you're doing something that needs very crisp colorwork lines, you might not want to choose a rustic, like fuzzy yarn, right? Because you want it to be crisp and you want each stitch to be shown and the graphic design and the sweater pattern. That was a hard lesson I learned from designing my terrain hat duo, where my first sample I made in Drops Nepal, my second sample I made in Barocco Vintage Chunky, and the second sample loved so much more because the stitch definition in Barocco Vintage Chunky is so crisp and so much like fuller than Drops Nepal. So that's just something to keep in mind, and you kind of learn that by trial and error. You can also obviously like look up Reddit, and like also another feature of Ravelry is you can go on the Yarn Ideas tab to figure out what other people used for that exact same pattern. You can click on that yarn or that project that used that yarn and then figure out if that's a yarn you want to use for your project. Well, I hope you guys found this video helpful. I hope you found it informative. If you are interested in other videos along these lines, either instructional videos, knitting podcast videos, just designing behind the scenes videos, please like and subscribe this video. That helps out small channels so much, and I would really love to see some growth as well as build some community. So I hope you guys have a great day. I hope you've been drinking and sipping on something warm and lovely. I would also love to know what you guys are knitting on right now if you're knitting while watching this video. So please drop in the comments what project you're currently working on. I would absolutely love to hear. Okay, bye guys!